The fairground was a kaleidoscope of colors, laughter, and music that drifted on the evening breeze, wrapping itself around the town like an old, familiar blanket. To the townspeople, it was a beloved annual tradition, a place where children's eyes sparkled with excitement and adults could briefly recapture their youth. But beneath the bright lights and cheerful facade lay a darkness that had been forgotten by most, except by those who could never forget. Johnny Thompson, the fairground clown, stood backstage, his painted smile a stark contrast to the unease gnawing at his insides. He had been part of the fair for over a decade, a fixture in his oversized shoes, frizzy red wig, and gaudy polka-dotted suit. Despite his outward jolliness, Johnny carried a burden, an unshakable feeling that something sinister lurked in the shadows of the merry-go-rounds and Ferris wheels. As he adjusted his makeup, a chill ran down his spine, the same chill that had started a few nights ago, making his dreams restless and his waking hours fraught with a sense of impending doom. He couldn't place its origin, but it had grown stronger, more insistent, as the fair approached this year. The night was still young and the crowds were thickening. Children with sticky cotton candy fingers and parents with weary smiles ambled through the maze of stalls and rides. The laughter was infectious, yet for Johnny, it was tinged with an eerie echo, as if some of it belonged to unseen spectators. Johnny's first performance was about to begin. As he stepped out into the spotlight, the familiar cheers washed over him. He performed his usual antics, juggling pratfalls and exaggerated expressions, earning delighted giggles from the children and appreciative smiles from the adults. Yet behind each laugh he sensed a whisper, a faint murmur that seemed to rise from the very ground he stood on. His routine concluded, Johnny took his final bow. The applause was as loud as ever, but as he exited the stage, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by the audience, but by something else, something unseen and malevolent. Backstage, he found himself drawn to the old carousel at the fair's edge. It was a beautiful relic, its wooden horses carved with meticulous detail, their painted eyes seemingly following onlookers. But tonight, those eyes felt more alive, more aware. He approached the carousel, the festive music now sounding distorted, almost mournful. "Johnny," a faint voice called. He froze, every hair on his body standing on end. The voice was childlike, filled with sorrow. "Johnny, why didn't you save us?" He spun around, but the space was empty. Heart pounding, he backed away from the carousel, his eyes wide with fear. The memory of the accident began to surface, images of broken bodies and silent screams flashing in his mind. He had tried to forget, to bury the guilt and the horror. But the past, it seemed, had clawed its way back, refusing to be silenced. The fairground had a dark history, one that was about to resurface with a vengeance. Johnny didn't know it yet, but the spirits of the children who had died in the tragic accident were awakening, seeking justice, and perhaps something more. The cheerful facade of the fairground was about to crack, revealing the darkness that lurked beneath, and Johnny was at the heart of it all. Johnny's nights had always been filled with vibrant dreams of laughter and applause, but now they had transformed into a grotesque carousel of nightmares. Every time he closed his eyes, he was transported back to the day of the accident, the screams, the blood, the unbearable guilt. He awoke each morning drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Tonight was no different. Johnny lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The clock on the nightstand read 3 a.m., the hour when the veil between the living and the dead was said to be thinnest. He tried to shake off the lingering dread and closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, but as soon as he did, the whispers began again. "Johnny, why didn't you save us?" He bolted upright, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice was clearer this time, closer. He glanced around the small trailer that served as his home during the fair season. Shadows danced on the walls, contorted into nightmarish shapes by the flickering light of the old lamp on his nightstand. He climbed out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold floor. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and he shivered as he made his way to the window. Pulling back the curtain, he peered outside. The fairground was eerily quiet, the rides and stalls standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. A movement caught his eye. Near the old carousel, a figure stood, a small child, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their face pale and eyes hollow. Johnny's heart stopped. He blinked, and the figure was gone. He closed the curtain and backed away, his mind reeling. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "It's just a bad dream." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The fairground's dark history was coming back to haunt him, and he was powerless to stop it. The next morning, Johnny stumbled into the fairground's main tent, bleary-eyed and exhausted. His colleagues noticed his haggard appearance and exchanged worried glances, but no one dared to ask. The fairground thrived on its cheerful atmosphere, and no one wanted to acknowledge the shadows lurking beneath the surface. As Johnny applied his makeup in front of the mirror, his reflection seemed to mock him. The painted smile looked grotesque, a cruel caricature of the joy he was supposed to bring. He splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the lingering fear, but it clung to him like a second skin. He was about to head to his first performance when he heard it again, a child's laugh, high-pitched and echoing through the tent. He froze, his blood running cold. The laugh was followed by a whisper, so faint he could barely make it out. "Johnny?" He turned, but the tent was empty. His hands trembled as he clutched his juggling balls, the familiar weight offering little comfort. The performance went by in a blur, his movements mechanical, his mind elsewhere. The audience's laughter rang hollow in his ears, overshadowed by the ghostly whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere. After the show, Johnny sought out the fairground's owner, Mr. Hawkins, a grizzled old man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He found him near the ticket booth, counting the day's earnings. "Mr. Hawkins, we need to talk," Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hawkins looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What is it, Johnny? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Johnny replied, the weight of his words sinking in. I think the fairground is haunted." Hawkins laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Haunted? By what, your bad dreams? Get a grip, man. This fairground's been here for years and nothing's ever happened." Johnny shook his head. "No, you don't understand. It's the children, the ones who died in the accident. They're trying to tell me something." Hawkins' expression darkened. "That's enough, Johnny. We don't talk about that here. The past is the past. Now go get some rest and stop scaring yourself." Johnny walked away, feeling more isolated than ever. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. He couldn't escape them, couldn't silence the voices of the children who had perished. They wanted something from him, and he feared what would happen if he couldn't give it to them. As the sun set and the fairground came to life once more, Johnny knew he was on borrowed time. The spirits were restless, and their vengeance was just beginning. The fairground was a hive of activity as the evening crowds poured in. Johnny forced a smile as he navigated through the bustling throng, his painted face concealing the turmoil within. He tried to focus on his duties, but the whispers gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, refusing to be ignored. As night fell, the fairground's atmosphere grew even more eerie. The garish lights cast long, distorted shadows, and the cheerful music took on a haunting tone. Johnny's unease intensified with every passing hour, and by the time the fair began to wind down, he was on edge, every nerve taut. He retired to his trailer, hoping for a few hours of respite, but sleep eluded him. The whispers began as soon as he closed his eyes, soft and insistent. "Johnny, Johnny." He bolted upright, heart pounding. The room was deathly silent, save for the soft creak of the trailer settling. He got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. The fairground lay quiet and still under the moonlight, but Johnny felt a presence, an unseen watcher in the darkness. He turned away, but a sudden noise froze him in place. A soft, childlike giggle echoed through the trailer. He spun around, eyes wide, but saw nothing. The giggle was followed by a whisper, closer this time, as if the speaker were right beside him. "Why didn't you save us, Johnny?" He backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice was filled with sorrow and accusation, each word a dagger to his heart. He stumbled into the small kitchenette, grabbing a knife from the drawer, as if the cold steel could somehow protect him from the spectral tormentors. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned, knife raised, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder, and he felt a chill seep into his bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping and echoing in a cacophony of anguish. "Save us, Johnny, save us." He dropped the knife, clutching his head in his hands. "Stop it!" he shouted. "Just stop!" The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Johnny stood trembling, the knife lying forgotten at his feet. He sank to the floor, tears streaming down his face. The weight of his guilt was crushing, the memories of the accident flooding back with brutal clarity. He had been there that day, had seen the tragedy unfold. The ride malfunctioned, the screams, the chaos. He had tried to help, but it was too late. The image of the lifeless children haunted him, their faces etched into his memory. He had failed them, and now their spirits sought retribution. As dawn approached, Johnny made a decision. He couldn't endure this torment any longer. He had to find a way to make amends, to lay the spirits to rest. He wiped his tears and stood, determination replacing his fear. The fairground held the key to their salvation, and he would uncover its secrets no matter the cost. Johnny spent the next day in a haze, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He avoided his colleagues, their concerned looks only adding to his anxiety. He had no answers for them, only a growing certainty that he was running out of time. That night, as the fairground lights dimmed and the crowds dispersed, Johnny set out with a flashlight and a sense of purpose. He walked to the carousel, the site of the accident, and stood before it, his heart heavy with dread. "Show yourselves," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I want to help you." The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft and mournful. "Help us, Johnny. Save us." The carousel began to turn slowly, its music a distorted lullaby. Johnny watched, transfixed, as ghostly figures appeared, their faces pale and eyes hollow. The children reached out to him, their expressions a mix of hope and despair. Johnny stepped forward, his resolve firm. "I'll find a way," he promised. "I'll save you." The figures faded, and the carousel ground to a halt. The whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Johnny knew he had taken the first step, but the road ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. The fairground's dark history was a tangled web, and unraveling it would require courage and sacrifice. As he walked back to his trailer, Johnny felt a glimmer of hope. The spirits had reached out to him, and he had answered. Now he had to follow through on his promise, to uncover the truth and lay their souls to rest. The fairground held many secrets, and Johnny was determined to reveal them, no matter what horrors lay in wait. Johnny spent the next few days in a fog of dread and determination. He had to understand what happened during the accident to help the children and free himself from their haunting whispers. His sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares that replayed the tragedy in gruesome detail. The more he remembered, the more he realized how deeply the fairground's dark past was intertwined with his own life. On a particularly gray morning, Johnny visited the fairground archives, a dusty, neglected room filled with old records and forgotten memories. He sifted through piles of papers, searching for any clues about the accident. The room smelled of mildew and decay, the scent of forgotten tragedies and buried secrets. After hours of searching, Johnny found a newspaper clipping buried beneath stacks of faded photographs. The headline screamed at him, "Tragic fairground accident claims lives of 6 children." The article detailed the horrific event, a ride malfunction that had sent the children hurtling to their deaths. Johnny's hands trembled as he read the names of the victims, each one a knife to his heart. But there was something else, a name that made his blood run cold. The ride operator, the one blamed for the malfunction, was none other than his own father. Johnny had been just a boy then, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, but old enough to feel the weight of his father's guilt. His father had always been distant after the accident, a shadow of the man he once was. The guilt and shame had consumed him, driving him to the bottle and ultimately to an early grave. Johnny remembered the nights he would hear his father weeping, the sound mingling with the ghostly whispers that now haunted him. Tears blurred Johnny's vision as he clutched the newspaper clipping. He had inherited his father's burden, the curse that now plagued him. But unlike his father, Johnny was determined to make things right. He needed to learn more about the accident, to uncover the details that had been buried by time and sorrow. He decided to visit the old ride operator, Mr. Jenkins, who had worked at the fairground for as long as anyone could remember. If anyone knew what happened that fateful day, it was him. Mr. Jenkins lived in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Johnny knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a stooped elderly man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. "Johnny Thompson," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice raspy with age. "I wondered when you'd come knocking." Johnny swallowed hard. "I need to know about the accident, Mr. Jenkins, the one that killed the children." Mr. Jenkins sighed and stepped aside, motioning for Johnny to enter. The house was cluttered with old memorabilia, relics of a bygone era. Johnny followed Mr. Jenkins to a small, cluttered living room where they sat in worn armchairs. "It was a terrible day," Mr. Jenkins began, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Your father was a good man, Johnny. He didn't deserve the blame." Johnny listened intently as Mr. Jenkins recounted the events of that fateful day. The ride had malfunctioned due to a faulty part, a defect that no one had noticed until it was too late. The children had been thrown from their seats, their laughter turning to screams of terror. Johnny's father had tried to save them, but it was a losing battle. There was nothing he could do. Mr. Jenkins said, his eyes misting over. "The Fairground covered it up, blamed your father to avoid a scandal. It wasn't right." Johnny felt a surge of anger and sorrow. His father had been a scapegoat, a victim of the Fairground's greed and corruption. The children had died because of negligence, and their spirits had been trapped ever since, seeking justice. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Johnny said, his voice choked with emotion. "I need to find a way to free their spirits. Do you know how I can help them?" Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "I'm not sure, Johnny, but maybe there's something at the site of the accident, something that can give you a clue." Johnny left the house with a renewed sense of purpose. He would visit the site of the accident, the old abandoned ride that had been left to rot after the tragedy. There he hoped to find the answers he needed to lay the spirits to rest. That night, as Johnny approached the dilapidated ride, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air was thick with the presence of the spirits, their sorrow and anger palpable. Johnny steeled himself, stepping into the shadows of the past, determined to uncover the truth and bring peace to the restless souls. The Fairground was a place of laughter and joy, but beneath its cheerful facade lay a darkness that refused to be forgotten. Johnny was about to confront that darkness, to face the ghosts of the past, and make amends for his father's sins. The journey would be perilous, filled with danger and despair, but Johnny was ready. The children deserved justice, and he would stop at nothing to give it to them. Johnny's discovery of the Fairground's dark secrets weighed heavily on him. Each day, he donned his clown costume with a growing sense of dread, knowing that the children's spirits were watching, waiting. His performances, once a source of joy, became a macabre dance with the dead. As the sun set and the Fairground came to life, Johnny prepared for another show. The vibrant lights and cheerful music were now a cruel mockery of the terror that lurked beneath the surface. He painted his face, his reflection in the mirror, a haunting reminder of his burden. The painted smile felt like a mask hiding the fear and sorrow that gnawed at his soul. Stepping onto the stage, Johnny forced a smile as he juggled brightly colored balls and performed his exaggerated pratfalls. The audience's laughter rang hollow in his ears, drowned out by the whispers that followed him everywhere. "Save us, Johnny." He stumbled, the balls falling from his hands. The crowd gasped, but Johnny barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on a group of children standing at the edge of the stage, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Ghostly images superimposed over the living, their sorrowful expressions a stark contrast to the delighted faces around them. Johnny's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to continue to push through the performance, but the apparitions grew bolder, their voices louder. They reached out to him, their hands cold and spectral, passing through his flesh. "Help us!" The final act of his performance involved a classic trick, the bucket of confetti. As he lifted the bucket, his hands trembling, the confetti turned to ash, sifting through his fingers like the remnants of a forgotten dream. The children's voices rose to a crescendo, a wail of despair that shattered the fragile veneer of normalcy. Johnny dropped the bucket and fled the stage, the audience's confused murmurs chasing him into the shadows. He burst through the tent's back entrance, collapsing against the side of the old carousel. The once cheerful music now sounded like a dirge, a mournful melody that echoed his despair. As he caught his breath, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Lily, the Fairground's fortune teller, her eyes filled with concern. She had always seemed to know more than she let on, her cryptic warnings and mysterious demeanor now taking on a new significance. "Johnny, you can't keep running," she said softly. The spirits are restless. They need your help." He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know what to do, Lily. I'm just a clown. How can I save them?" Lily knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're more than just a clown, Johnny. You have a connection to these spirits, a responsibility. You must confront the past, face the truth, and find a way to bring them peace." Johnny nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He couldn't continue living in fear, haunted by the ghosts of the children he had failed to save. He had to do something, anything, to end their suffering. With renewed determination, Johnny rose to his feet. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady. "But I need your help, Lily. I can't do this alone." Lily nodded, her eyes serious. "I'll help you, Johnny, but we must act quickly. The spirits grow stronger each night, and their anger is building. We must find a way to appease them before it's too late." Together, they made their way to the abandoned ride, the site of the tragic accident. The ride stood as a ghostly sentinel, its rusted metal and decaying wood a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Johnny felt the weight of the children's eyes upon him, their whispers growing louder as he approached. Lily began to chant softly, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the rising tension. She placed candles around the ride, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. Johnny watched, his heart pounding as she performed the ritual, her words a plea for peace and forgiveness. The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. The ghostly children appeared, their faces twisted in agony. Johnny stepped forward, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what happened. Please, tell me how I can help you find peace." The children's leader, a small girl with blonde curls and a sad smile, stepped forward. "We need justice," she said, her voice echoing with sorrow. "The truth must be known. Only then can we rest." Johnny nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The Fairground's dark secret had to be exposed, the truth of the accident revealed. He would find a way to bring justice to the children, to lift the burden from his soul and theirs. As the ritual concluded, the children's apparitions faded, their whispers growing fainter. Johnny felt a glimmer of hope. He had taken the first step, but the journey was far from over. The haunted performances would continue, the spirit's presence a constant reminder of his mission. But now, he had a purpose, a way forward. The fairground's lights dimmed as the night drew to a close. Johnny stood beside Lily, the weight of his promise heavy on his shoulders. He would uncover the truth, expose the lies, and bring peace to the restless spirits. The journey would be perilous, but Johnny was ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The fairground's dark history would no longer be hidden, and the children's voices would finally be heard. Johnny's resolve to uncover the truth about the tragic accident grew stronger with each passing day. He knew that exposing the fairground's dark secrets was the only way to bring peace to the children's spirits. With Lily's help, he began his quest for answers, delving deeper into the fairground's past and the events that had led to the horrific accident. Their first stop was the town's public library, a dusty, dimly lit building filled with the scent of old paper and forgotten stories. Johnny and Lily combed through newspaper archives, legal documents, and personal accounts, piecing together the puzzle of what had really happened that fateful day. As they dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. The ride that had malfunctioned had been reported for safety issues multiple times before the accident. The fairgrounds management had ignored these warnings, choosing profit over safety. The realization made Johnny's blood boil. The children had died because of negligence and greed, and his father had been made a scapegoat to protect the fairgrounds' reputation. One afternoon, while poring over an old newspaper article, Johnny found a name that caught his attention: Walter Grimes, the Fairground's head of maintenance at the time of the accident. According to the article, Grimes had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the tragedy. Johnny felt a surge of hope. If he could find Grimes, he might uncover more about the cover-up and the true cause of the accident. Lily managed to track down an address for Grimes in a neighboring town. It was a long shot, but Johnny knew they had to pursue every lead. They drove out to the dilapidated house, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. The place had an air of abandonment, but Johnny felt a strange pull, as if the spirits were guiding him. They knocked on the door, and after a tense moment it creaked open to reveal a haggard man with a haunted look in his eyes. Walter Grimes had aged considerably, his face etched with lines of worry and regret. He eyed Johnny and Lily warily, his posture defensive. "We're not here to cause trouble, Mr. Grimes," Johnny said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We just want to know the truth about the accident at the fairground. The children. They need justice." Grimes hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and guilt. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Inside, the house was cluttered with old papers and forgotten memories. They sat in the dimly lit living room and Grimes began to speak, his voice trembling. "I didn't want to be part of it," he said, staring at his hands. "But they threatened me. Said they'd ruin my life if I didn't go along with the cover-up. The ride was faulty, everyone knew it, but they didn't want to spend the money to fix it. After the accident, they blamed your father, Johnny. They needed a scapegoat, and he was the easiest target." Johnny's hands clenched into fists, his anger boiling over. "My father died because of their lies," he said through gritted teeth. "Those children died because of their greed." Grimes nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I've lived with the guilt for years. I tried to forget, but the memories, they haunt me. I'm so sorry, Johnny. I wish I'd had the courage to speak up back then." Lily placed a comforting hand on Grimes's shoulder. "It's not too late to make things right," she said gently. "We need your help to expose the truth, to bring justice to those who died." Grimes took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll do whatever I can to help. I have documents, records that prove the fairground's negligence. They're hidden in my old workshop. If we can get them, we can finally expose the truth." The next day, they went to Grimes's workshop, an old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found boxes of dusty documents and blueprints, evidence of the fairground's negligence and the cover-up that had followed the accident. Johnny felt a mix of triumph and sorrow as they gathered the evidence. The truth was finally within reach, but it had come at a terrible cost. That night, Johnny returned to the fairground, the documents clutched in his hands. The whispers of the children grew louder, their voices filled with hope and anticipation. He knew what he had to do. He would present the evidence to the authorities, expose the fairground's dark secrets, and bring justice to the spirits that haunted him. But as he stood before the old carousel, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The fairground's owners wouldn't let the truth come out without a fight, and Johnny knew he was in for a battle. With the spirits by his side and Lily's unwavering support, Johnny was ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The fairground's dark history would no longer be hidden, and the children's voices would finally be heard. The journey was far from over, but Johnny felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was a powerful weapon, and he was determined to use it to set the spirits free. The fairground hummed with its usual gaiety, but Johnny felt the tension in the air. Armed with the damning documents, he knew the time had come to confront the fairground's owners. and bring the truth to light. However, he also knew that the spirits of the children, now emboldened by the promise of justice, had their own plans for revenge. That evening, Johnny gathered his courage and made his way to Mr. Hawkins's office. He clutched the documents tightly, his knuckles white. Lily had warned him to be cautious, but the urgency of the children's whispers pushed him forward. He had to end this now before more lives were lost. He entered the office, finding Mr. Hawkins hunched over his desk, counting the day's earnings. The room was dimly lit, shadows flickering against the walls. Hawkins looked up, his eyes narrowing when he saw Johnny. "What do you want, Johnny?" Hawkins growled. "I don't have time for your nonsense." Johnny slammed the documents on the desk, his voice steady. "These are proof of your negligence, Hawkins. The ride was faulty and you knew it. You covered it up and blamed my father. The children who died that day deserve justice, and I'm going to make sure they get it." Hawkins's face twisted with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. Get out of here before I call security." But Johnny stood his ground. "I'm not leaving. The authorities will hear about this and the fairground will be shut down. You'll pay for what you've done." As Johnny turned to leave, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lights. The temperature plummeted, and Hawkins's eyes widened in fear. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the room with their mournful chorus. "Justice. Save us." Ghostly figures materialized around them, the children's faces pale and their eyes hollow. They moved towards Hawkins, their expressions filled with sorrow and anger. Hawkins backed away, his bravado crumbling in the face of the supernatural onslaught. "No, stay away," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. It wasn't my fault." But the spirits were relentless. They reached out with spectral hands, their touch freezing cold. Hawkins screamed as the temperature continued to drop, his breath visible in the frigid air. The children's whispers became a deafening roar, their cries for justice echoing through the office. Johnny watched, a mixture of fear and vindication in his heart. The spirits were taking their revenge, punishing the man who had wronged them. But as Hawkins fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror, Johnny felt a pang of pity. This wasn't just about revenge. The children needed peace, and vengeance alone wouldn't give it to them. "Stop," Johnny cried out, stepping forward. "This isn't the way. We need to bring the truth to light, to let the world know what happened. Only then can you rest." The spirits hesitated, their forms flickering. The leader, the small girl with blonde curls, turned to Johnny, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and sorrow. "We want justice," she whispered, "but we also want peace." Johnny nodded, his resolve firm. "And you'll get it. I promise. But let him live to face the consequences. The world needs to know the truth." The spirits slowly retreated, their whispers fading into the cold night air. Hawkins collapsed, shivering and broken, his eyes filled with a haunted look. Johnny picked up the documents and left the office, knowing that the first battle was won, but the war was far from over. The next day, Johnny and Lily went to the authorities, presenting the evidence and recounting the story of the fairground's dark past. The news spread quickly and the town was thrown into turmoil. The fairground was shut down pending investigation, and Hawkins was arrested, facing charges of negligence and manslaughter. As the truth came to light, the fairground became a place of mourning rather than joy. The townspeople gathered to pay their respects to the children who had died, their sorrow mixed with relief that justice was finally being served. Johnny returned to the fairground one last time, standing before the old carousel. The whispers were gone, replaced by a peaceful silence. The spirits had found their justice, and in doing so, had found peace. The fairground's dark history had been exposed and the children's voices had been heard. Lily joined him, her eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. "You did it, Johnny. You set them free." Johnny nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "We did it, Lily. They can rest now, and so can I." The fairground, once a place of laughter and joy, had become a symbol of the past's power to haunt the present. But through courage and determination, Johnny had uncovered the truth, bringing justice to the children and peace to their restless souls. The journey had been fraught with danger and despair, but in the end, the darkness had been dispelled, and the spirits had found their rest. With the fairground shut down and Hawkins facing justice, the town began to heal. However, Johnny knew his journey was not yet complete. The children's spirits had found some peace, but the past still loomed large in his own life. It was time to confront the final piece of the puzzle, his father's legacy. Johnny had always avoided his childhood home, a place filled with painful memories of his father's descent into despair. But now he felt a strange pull to return, to uncover the truth behind his father's actions and lay his own demons to rest. With Lily by his side, he drove to the old house on the outskirts of town. The house was in disrepair, its paint peeling and windows cracked. Johnny hesitated at the front door, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Lily squeezed his hand, offering silent support. Taking a deep breath, Johnny pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The interior was filled with dust and cobwebs, a testament to the years of neglect. Johnny felt a pang of sorrow as he walked through the familiar rooms, each one a reminder of happier times now lost to history. He made his way to his father's study, a place that had always been off-limits to him as a child. The study was cluttered with old papers and books, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. Johnny began to search through the piles, looking for anything that might shed light on his father's actions. After hours of searching, he found an old leather-bound journal hidden in a drawer. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with his father's cramped handwriting. Johnny sat down and began to read, his heart heavy with anticipation. The journal detailed his father's life at the fairground, his dedication to his work, and the growing concerns about the safety of the rides. His father had known about the faulty equipment but had been powerless to do anything about it. The management had ignored his warnings, prioritizing profits over safety. As Johnny read further, he found entries that spoke of his father's guilt and despair after the accident. He had tried to save the children, but his efforts had been in vain. The blame placed on him by the fairground's management had destroyed him, driving him to drink and eventually to his death. Tears streamed down Johnny's face as he read the final entry. It was a letter to him, written in his father's shaky hand. "My dear Johnny, I am so sorry for everything. I tried to do the right thing, but I failed. The weight of the children's deaths is too much to bear. I hope one day you can forgive me and find peace. Always remember, I loved you more than anything in this world. Love, Dad." Johnny clutched the journal to his chest, sobs racking his body. The pain and guilt he had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a deep sense of sorrow and understanding. His father had been a victim just like the children, and he had done his best in an impossible situation. Lily knelt beside him, her arms around his shoulders. "It's okay, Johnny. You face the truth. Your father's spirit can rest now, knowing you found peace." Johnny nodded, wiping away his tears. He felt a newfound resolve, a sense of closure he had never thought possible. The fairground's dark history had been exposed, and the spirits of the past could finally rest. As they left the house, Johnny felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had confronted the past and emerged stronger for it. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. He had brought justice to the children, cleared his father's name, and found peace within himself. The town continued to heal, the fairground slowly being dismantled and replaced with a memorial to the children who had lost their lives. Johnny visited the memorial often, a place of reflection and remembrance. The whispers were gone, replaced by a serene silence that spoke of peace and closure. Johnny knew that life would go on, and the scars of the past would eventually fade. But he would always remember the journey he had taken, the courage it had required, and the peace it had brought. The fairground's dark history had been confronted, and the ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. Though the fairground was shuttered and the town had begun to heal, Johnny knew deep down that the journey was not yet over. The children's spirits had quieted, but they were not completely at rest. There was one final act needed to bring true peace to the restless souls and to himself. Late one evening, Johnny received a chilling message. His breath frosted the air as he read the words scrawled across his bathroom mirror in what seemed like condensation, but he knew better. "Meet us at the carousel, midnight." He knew this was the children's final plea, their last request for justice. Determined, Johnny gathered the documents, the journal, and the courage he had mustered over these last harrowing weeks. Lily insisted on accompanying him, her unwavering support a beacon in the growing darkness. As midnight approached, they stood before the old carousel, the once cheerful ride now a decaying monument to the past. The night was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Johnny felt the familiar chill, the spectral presence of the children growing stronger with each passing moment. The carousel began to turn, its music slow and haunting. The ghostly figures of the children appeared, their faces solemn. The leader, the small girl with blonde curls, stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Johnny's. "We need the final truth," she whispered. "Show them what happened. Make them remember." Johnny nodded and began to recite the events, his voice clear and unwavering. He spoke of the negligence, the cover-up, and the tragic accident. He read from his father's journal, sharing the heartfelt apologies and the truth about his father's efforts to save the children. The documents he had gathered were laid out, irrefutable evidence of the fairground's culpability. As he spoke, the air grew colder, and the spirits of the children drew closer, their expressions softening from anger to understanding. The carousel's music slowed further, its tune a melancholy dirge that echoed through the empty fairground. Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. Mr. Hawkins, drawn by some unseen force, stumbled into the light. His eyes were wild, his face pale with fear and remorse. He seemed compelled to speak, as if the spirits themselves were guiding his actions. I lied," Hawkins confessed, his voice trembling. "I knew the ride was faulty. I ignored the warnings. I blamed your father to save myself. It was all my fault." The children's spirits surrounded Hawkins, their presence almost tangible. The small girl stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and forgiveness. "You must make amends," she said softly. "Only then can we rest." Hawkins fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." In that moment, the oppressive chill lifted, replaced by a feeling of warmth and peace. The children's spirits began to fade, their faces serene. The small girl looked at Johnny one last time, her expression grateful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the still night air. "You've set us free." As the last of the spirits vanished, Johnny felt a profound sense of relief. The burden he had carried for so long was finally lifted. The truth had been revealed and justice had been served. The children could rest, and so could he. Hawkins, still kneeling on the ground, looked up at Johnny with red-rimmed eyes. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Johnny helped him to his feet. "You'll confess everything to the authorities," he said. "Make sure the world knows the truth." "It's the least you can do." Hawkins nodded, his face etched with regret. "I will. I promise." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Johnny and Lily walked away from the fairground. The old carousel stood silent, a relic of a bygone era. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought healing and closure. The town continued to honor the memory of the children. The fairground transformed into a peaceful memorial. Johnny often visited, reflecting on the past and the journey that had brought him here. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence that spoke of peace and reconciliation. Johnny knew he would never forget the faces of the children or the horrors of the fairground, but he also knew that he had done everything in his power to bring justice and peace. The final showdown had been fought and won, and the spirits had found their rest. As he stood before the memorial, Johnny felt a sense of hope for the future. The darkness had been dispelled and the ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. The journey was over, but the lessons learned would stay with him forever, and with Lily by his side, he knew he could face whatever the future held. The fairground's dark history had been confronted and conquered, and the children's voices had finally been heard.